and we are gonna talk about the history of video games in 8 bits. So, welcome to the session. Hi. So, video games are less than a century old, but today you kind of have to hide under a rock to avoid kids doing Fortnite dances. So, we're gonna very briefly look at how video games grew up into a massive cultural force in less than 100 years. We're gonna split it up into 8 bits, just to make it easier to digest and remember. Bit 1, what is a video game? If you ask anybody 100 years ago, they wouldn't know, because there was no such thing as a video game. There's some debate as to what the first video game was, and the main reason for that is because people's definitions of what a video game is varies slightly, person to person. Some people say, if it's electronic, it's a video game. Some people say, no, it needs a raster or vector display, then it's a video game. Some people say, it needs to be digital, it can't be an analog machine. So, a couple early ones, there was this giant computer called Birdie the Brain, that's going to be on the right here. It plays tic-tac-toe. You can input moves, and it'll play against you, and either you win or the computer wins. It was wicked cool in the days when computers were just coming out. There was another early one in 1958, played on an oscilloscope screen. So an engineering tool, they hooked up a bunch of sensors and used some of them as input devices, played this game called Tennis for Two. It drew a line for the tennis court, a little line for the net, and there was this ball that bounced back and forth. So most of these only existed in labs. They definitely weren't available to the masses. But the first digital video game that attained somewhat widespread popularity was Computer Space. That's the one that you see in the footage right here. It was developed at MIT by a bunch of students in the Tech Model Railroad Club for the PDP-1 computer. It was basically a 50 sci-fi fan's dream, because you could fly your own spaceship, you can shoot at the other ship, this well in the middle sucks you in with gravity. If you get caught in that, then you lose. You can also shoot the other person. That's kind of the goal of the game. There's also a button you can press to hyperspace, and you'll warp to a random position on the screen, which may help you, may hurt you, but if you're in a pinch, it's better than dying. So, this game slowly spread throughout the country through universities and research labs. There was this one guy named Nolan Bushnell who loved Space War. He wasn't the best engineering student, but he was pretty darn good at Space War. Maybe some of us can relate to that in college. I'll come back to him. So meanwhile, there was this highly skilled engineer at Magnavox named Ralph Baer. He's sometimes called the father of video games. He tested TVs sometimes, and he had this instrument to test all the different colors and different pixels. And he thought it was so cool that you take this device, and you just turn some knobs or buttons, and your input manipulates what's on a TV screen. And he thought, hey, we should market this. Other people are going to want to do this too. It'll be amazing. And the company was like, not so much. Let's not do that. So he kept working on it. He pitched the idea to a few other companies. Eventually, Magnavox gave in, and they were like, okay, we'll try this. They made a prototype called the black box, or the brown box, made a console called the Magnavox Odyssey, which was the first commercial home video game console. It had 2 controllers, you had knobs. The graphics were just 2 dots on a screen and 1 little dot. And you changed the game to one of 8 different games. Part of that process was putting an overlay on the TV screen that had a tennis court or a baseball field. And so the graphics were very primitive. Anyway, that engineering student I talked about, Nolan Bushnell, became an engineer. He met a bunch of other engineers, and he loved Space War, so he was like, hey, we should make something out of this and commercialize it. They made this game called Computer Space, which was way simpler than Space War, because it had to be a lot cheaper to go anywhere that the public could get to it. And they partnered up with some other company, did it through a contract. So they weren't going bust if this game didn't work. And it didn't work. They put it out, it worked well in 1 or 2 locations, but overall it was a flop. And they looked at, the only places it worked well were universities, where you had a lot of physics students and engineering students that could understand the complex physics of, hey, if I stop pressing the thruster, this ship keeps moving, and I can rotate it. And for most people, it was way too many inputs. You could rotate, you could fire, you could thrust, and people had never played video games before. Most of them never used computers before, so they just couldn't really handle it. So they decided, let's try something a lot simpler. And he'd seen the Magnavox Odyssey before. He decided to make this thing called Pong, where all you have is 2 buttons. Instead of half a book of instructions like Computer Space had, it was just 1 line. It was like, turn knob to move paddle, or something like that. And people got that. Someone put in a quarter, tried it out, it's like, that's kind of cool. Got his buddy. They put it at a test location called Handicap's Tavern, and they weren't too sure that it would work, but they got a call a few days later from the guy who owned the tavern, said, "Hey, you got to come on over and look at this Pong machine. It's not working anymore." So they went over. It looked like it was working, so they tried putting in a quarter to test it. The quarter wouldn't go in. They opened it up, and the machine was flooded with all the quarters people had put in. So it worked, which brings us to bit number 2, Atari. So initially, these two guys, Ted Dabney and Nolan Bushnell, incorporated this company. They wanted to call it syzygy, which means the alignment of the star of 3 celestial bodies. That name was taken, so instead they went with Atari, which is kind of like check in chess, but it's a term for a Japanese game called Go. So Pong worked. They basically just caught lightning in a bottle. But funny thing about that, it's hard to keep lightning in a bottle. So as soon as Pong started getting produced, they hired as many hippies as they could to produce as many cabinets as they could and get them distributed throughout the nation. It was an expensive process, but they were selling. But as fast as they could produce arcade cabinets, so could the competition, which saw their cabinets. In some cases, they just saw them and tried to mimic them. In some cases, they actually took them apart, reverse engineered them. In some rare cases, there was actually some corporate espionage going on. And you'll see this paddle ball, which looks very, very similar to Pong. It's almost the same colors. And there were dozens and dozens of these Pong clones. So Atari's strategy to stay ahead was, let's innovate. Let's stay ahead of the competition, make things that they have not made yet. So they made this game called Grand Track 10, where you have a pedal and a steering wheel and you're driving. They made this tank game called Tank. And it works pretty well. These games kept selling, kept spreading throughout the nation. There was already an established coin-op business, predating video arcades. So there was stuff like pinball. Jukeboxes were huge. Video games were actually very much governed by the American Music Operators Association, which controlled jukeboxes up until around the 80s. And so there was an industry for it. But again, the competition kept getting in their way. They wondered, how cheaply can we make Pong? Because Pong was popular. Everyone knew Pong. Well, a lot of people knew Pong. So they made Pong on a single circuit board, sold it as home Pong. But back in the day, you needed a retailer to sell anything nationwide. So they talked with all the retailers, and every single one of them turned them down. Magnavox was selling their Odyssey, but that system was only for the very rich. It cost $99, which was about $600 when you adjust for inflation, for this thing that nobody's ever used before. There was also, Eventually, they got the guy from Sears who was involved with sports, and he thought this Pong thing was really cool. So he got it into Sears, and it sold very well, sold out, and after that, other retailers picked it up. And as soon as they could make it, imitators produced knockoff Pongs. My dad used to have a knockoff home Pong. They were all over the place. Yeah, Atari decided, okay, it costs a lot of money to make a different system for each game that we want to put out. So how about we make one system with interchangeable software, which was a big trend in computing. If you look through computing history, it always moves towards systems that can do more different things, more versatile, runs an array of functions. Like, think of phones. They used to just call, now they do everything. So they developed the Atari VCS, as it was called at the time, later rebranded as the 2600, and it had interchangeable cartridges. So you could actually buy one console, and then instead of shelling out a bunch of money for a whole new console, you just pay a little bit of money for this cartridge. And you could put a bunch of innovative games on there and make a lot more money, because people want to buy a lot of games. So it's also a lot cheaper to make a cartridge than it is to make a console. So they made this, and they didn't have enough money to actually make it and produce it and sell it to retailers. So what they did was they talked to a bunch of people with a lot of money and got themselves bought out by Time Warner. So they now had the capital to make the Atari 2600, put it on the market, engineer a lot of games for it. It did really well. Now, one of the issues was, now that they are making not only arcade games but software, video games, they also have Time Warner over their heads, and they have this big corporate head that is has a very different corporate culture than this very hippie-driven, smoking in the office Atari. So a lot of people got upset about that. They had dress codes, had obnoxious security standards where you needed a key card to get everywhere, and they also didn't get credit for their games. So eventually a lot of people got fed up and left Atari, formed their own company called Activision, And later, more people left Atari, formed other video game companies. Activision was the biggest of these at first, and Activision actually credited people for their games, A, and B, they had a much less strict corporate culture at the time, so people enjoyed working there. Now, Activision decided to make cartridges for Atari's console. Atari was like, hey, you can't make games for our console. We're supposed to do that. They sued, but since Activision wasn't actually violating any patents, Activision won the suit, which opened the floodgates for other developers, some of them very small even, getting into this Atari cartridge market. In addition to other brands flooding Atari's console market, there was also imitators on the heels, like the Intellivision and ColecoVision. They came out, had way better graphics than Atari, and they did decently well. None of them did as well as the 2600, but they were still in the market. So to stay ahead, Atari again was like, what can we do? They started making a better console, the Atari 5200. Tried releasing that, and at this point, video games have been popular. Retailers is where all the games go through. They've been buying lots of games, lots of consoles, from all sorts of people, very cheaply, and back in this time, people usually bought electronic appliances once every 10, 20, 30 years. A TV lasts you 30 or 40 years. A radio could last you 50 or more years. And they weren't ready to buy another home console every year or every 6 months. So they stopped buying as many video games. These retailers suddenly had these bins full of video games that they couldn't sell very well, all these consoles on the shelves that aren't selling too well, and they went back to the console manufacturers, the developers, the publishers, and said, hey, we don't need any more. So suddenly, all these companies couldn't sell anything. And this was a huge issue because they had been focusing so much on competing, so much on growth to outgrow the competition, that they didn't put any money in the bank. So a few months of bad sales, most of these companies went under, out of the race completely. Atari kind of went out of business slowly and got restructured over the years. And most of the big players from this time completely disappeared in future markets, which gets into bit number 3, the Crash and the Commodore. So this became known as the video game crash of 1983. Arcades still existed in kind of a parallel market, but home consoles were a fad. It's like a fidget spinner. It was here, it was popular, but nobody wants that anymore. Who's going to pay for that? Let's see. So some of Atari's biggest hits at the time included E.T., which was very disappointing, and Pac-Man for the 2600, which they actually produced more Pac-Man cartridges than there were Atari consoles at the time. They thought, it's going to be so big, it'll sell consoles. And I'm just going to show you what Pac-Man looks like. It wasn't the most impressive. The Atari had very limited video memory, so there's 4 ghosts. They just can't all show up at once. So if you think that's a little bit different than the arcade experience, then the people in the 70s would agree with you. Excuse me, it's the 80s at this point. They would agree with you, and it didn't do as well as Atari hoped. They lost all their money, kind of went under. Now in this void, arcades were doing well, but PCs were also becoming more popular. Why buy? Consumers still had just as much money to spend, but why buy another console? Or it's more the same. When you could buy a PC, it does gaming, it also does calculations, it does like your taxes, and it's educational if you have kids. So much better for your family and for everyone to get a PC in their home. So PCs started selling like crazy, the most popular of these being the Commodore 64. There's a whole generation of kids, when they talk about video games as a kid, they're thinking PC games, primarily Commodore 64 video games. They had a lot of text adventures, which eventually evolved into MUDs and graphical adventures. MUDs are multi-user dungeons. If you have a network, you could play Dungeons & Dragons basically online with people. And there was also no shortage of action games, arcade-style games. You could also program yourself, which brought a lot of people to become software developers in the 90s and later when they grew up. All right. So IBM and Apple also put out their very important PCs around this time. They were much too expensive for most consumers, but they existed. Let's see. Oh no, we don't want more of that. Atari also got into the PC industry, put out the Atari ST. And the home video game market was basically gone until Nintendo came to America. Now granted, I am talking mostly about the American video game market. In Japan, video game consoles were still going just as strong. They never really went away. So one of the biggest companies over there was Nintendo. They were actually in talks for a long time about having a partnership with Atari and making Atari like the Nintendo of America kind of thing, while they handled Japan. But that kind of fell through. They also talked with Coleco about licensing their games to Coleco. That kind of fell through. So they just decided, okay, we'll do this ourselves. And in 1984, they brought their prototype, of the system that would later become the NES, to America. Brought it to the Consumer Electronics Show, which was the premier trade show for video games and technology in general. Video games didn't have their own trade show yet. And you can see that prototype in the top right. And people saw it and they were like, what's this Japanese company doing here? More importantly, why do they have a video game console? Don't they know that video games are over? And they sold exactly 0 units. So they did some studies, did some tests, and they actually did a very thorough study of what caused the video game crash in America and why Americans didn't want video games anymore. So they knew that Americans were very much into VCRs, home entertainment systems, and of course toys for their kids. Toys always do well. So they decided to market it more as a toy kind of thing. It's a Nintendo Entertainment System, not a home video system, or a home video game system. And in 1985, they came back to CES with the Nintendo Entertainment System. You put the cartridge in like it's a videotape, and you've got Rob, which is this robot toy that comes with it. And people kind of thought it was interesting, smirked, and nobody bought it. But Nintendo didn't give up. They were ready to take on this American market. So what they did was almost go door to door. They went through New York City and did a very big market test, where they got all the big box retailers that they could, all the department stores, and said, hey, we want to sell our NES, and A, you don't even need to set up the display. Just give us some floor space, we'll set up our own display. B, if it doesn't sell, we will buy back every single unit that does not sell. So they could potentially lose a lot of money through this. And so all they needed was floor space. And for the most part, it kind of worked. They sold about 50,000 of their 100,000 consoles at the time, and the retailers were happy enough with it that they generally kept the consoles, so Nintendo did not have to buy them back. And following that successful market test in 1985, they moved on to other big major cities in the United States, and by Christmas 1986, they were ready to take on the country. But retailers were still really cautious about video games, especially the national chains. So they made a partnership with Worlds of Wonder Toys, which was the biggest toy manufacturer at the time. Worlds of Wonder made Cabbage Patch Kids and laser tag, and they pretty much always made the hottest toy for the holidays. So Worlds of Wonder was talking to Sears or Toys R Us or Walmart, and they would say, hey, you can have our products, but you've also got to take this Nintendo stuff. Retailers were like, okay, fine, just give me your stuff. And they took on these Nintendos. So 1986, Nintendo sold across America. 1987, Nintendo could deal directly with the retailers because they had that much power now, and it was the most popular system of the holidays. So part of the product of Nintendo's study of the video game crash in America is they included a lockout chip in the NES, so you could not play unauthorized game cartridges. Nintendo had a very restrictive licensing deal where game developers, third parties, had to A, get their game approved by Nintendo, B, give Nintendo a cut, and C, their game cartridges actually had to be produced by Nintendo and then sold in stores. So Nintendo had all the controls. These game companies were also only allowed to put out 2 or 3 cartridges per year, so that encouraged them to put out their best work, and quality of games on the NES was far higher than that of any previous game console. They also put out the Game Boy, which Gunpei Yokoi is holding there. Came out in 1989. It used very cheap chips that took a lot less power and allowed them to sell the console a lot more cheaply. And as a result of that, Game Boy became synonymous with handheld gaming, and none of the competition could really touch it because the competition was generally using much more expensive, newer chips. They also put out Nintendo Power. There was a lot of culture around PC magazines at the time, and they kind of took a cue from that and built a whole culture around this Nintendo ecosystem. So around this time, Nintendo became synonymous with video games. It wasn't, can I play a video game with you? It's, hey, let's go play Nintendo. But then we get to the 90s, bit number 5, the rebellious 90s, characterized by a lot of upstarts and a lot of upsets in the industry. So Nintendo at this point got so big that everybody wanted to knock it down. A lot of upstarts tried to do just that, and did succeed at doing just that. First was Atari. They came back with the Atari 7800 system, which was actually supposed to release in 1983, but did not, for reasons we've already discussed. And at this point, it was 3 years old, and all its games were 3-year-old arcade games, and nobody really bought it. Atari kind of went out of business, got restructured again. But Sega did not. Sega had been very successful in the arcade market up to this point, and they saw video games getting big, so they started a very aggressive marketing campaign to get their new video game system, the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis, to consumers in America. And it did work in the end. They ended up winning over 50% of the American home console market share at their peak. They had a much more generous deal with third parties, which is part of why they were so successful. They could, in some cases, make more games for the console. They could make cartridges, so with Nintendo, if there's a chip shortage, Nintendo can't make your cartridge. So I'm sorry, Konami. Your 2,000 shipments of Ninja Gaiden will be delayed because we can't make them. And third party could do nothing about that. When it came to Sega, they could. They got a lot of third parties jumping on their bandwagon. They took a smaller cut for each game sold. That way they could grow their console infrastructure more. Arcades continued to get more advanced, and one big arcade game was Mortal Kombat, as pictured here. In fact, Mortal Kombat stood out for several reasons. One of those was that it had digitized actors, so it was actual humans in this game. Another one was that there was a lot of blood and guts, so you had people pulling each other's spines out, and it actually got noticed by the US government, to the point that there was a congressional hearing about violence in video games. Had that hearing not gone well, then there would be a federal acronym organization similar to the FCC or the FDA, which would have to approve every single video game before it was released. Now, that would leave the video game market looking radically different than it does now. That would kill indie developers, and not that there were any indies to speak of at the time, aside from the PC market. And game manufacturers didn't want that. Retailers, developers, nobody wanted that. So they had a bunch of meetings, and they were very tense meetings, mostly dominated by Nintendo and Sega, who kind of had it out to each other. A lot of tension, but eventually they hashed it out and made the ESA, the Trade Association for Video Games, which is around to this day, and one thing that they control is the ESRB, keeping the government happy since the early 90s. Another player that was growing in the PC market in the game market was EA. So at the time, in the 80s, PC games were often sold by very small developers. Oftentimes, they would make the games in their home, put them in a plastic bag with a paper manual, and then bring that to the local computer store, the Radio Shack or electronics boutique. And the retailer would put it on the shelf and it would sell. So you had a lot of small localized developers, and the presentation wasn't too great. EA, they decided, what if we treat the developers more like rock stars and treat this more like the music industry treats it? So they had these games with big, flashy box art mimicking the album covers in the record industry, and they gave credit to the developer. You can see Marble Madness here has the developers' names right on the title screen, well, the developer's name, and it did very, very well. So EA started growing. They actually cracked the unauthorized game protection on the Sega Genesis, so they went and told Sega, hey, we're going to make games for your console. You can work with us, or you can not work with us, and we'll do it anyway. So Sega worked with them. They got the EA Sports lineup on the Sega consoles, which helped Sega immensely. And they became partners for a while. Also on the PC, there was an explosion of first-person shooter games, which are kind of amazing because they look 3D. Most of the games at this time are 2D. And in 1995, we got Windows 95, which came with DirectX, which was a huge deal because it was a graphics library specifically designed for 3D games. There wasn't much like this at the time. You had the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, mostly running on 2D games. And here on the PC, you could get these games with 3D graphics, and they're running off CDs, so they can hold a lot more data. So the tech was there, and Sony took it and ran with it. They made a game console that ran on CDs, And so the games were a lot cheaper to produce than cartridges. They could hold a lot more data, and the console was designed from the ground up for 3D games. Now, the Sega Saturn came out, and it was not designed from the ground up for 3D games. It was very much designed for 2D games, and it's very difficult to get a 3D game running on the Sega Saturn. The Nintendo 64 was upcoming, but it kept getting delayed. So, they had E3, the very first one, in 1995. It was a trade show specifically for video games, because they'd grown big enough they could have their own, and there was enough money in the industry. And Sony came up on stage. I'm just going to show you a little clip of this guy telling people why they should buy a Sony console rather than a Sega or Nintendo console. The Saturn had just been announced. The price point was $399. Nintendo console was just getting delayed all over the place. So,
$299.
he just undercut the Sega Saturn by $100. And there was no 3D Nintendo console at the time. So, in addition to that, the Sony console was the cheapest CD player on the market when CDs were the big thing. So there was a lot of reasons to buy a PlayStation. Mario 64 kind of set the gold standard for 3D platforming, but sales of the Nintendo 64 were nowhere near that of the PlayStation. And coming up next, we're kind of going back, shifting to the PC marketplace again as Microsoft enters the zone, bit number 6. So we haven't really talked much about online gaming. Well, it started to become a thing in the 80s, actually. In the 90s, it started getting more and more popular, though, as first-person shooters were big, and online deathmatches became huge. There were actually collegiate Quake competitions before the year 2000, where you could win a $5,000 scholarship for winning. So thanks to DirectX, games were often run in 3D. In the early 2000s, we got EverQuest and RuneScape, which were kind of very defining in the MMO genre. RTS is really big, stuff like StarCraft and Command & Conquer. Adventure games hit their prime, dogfighting games were coming out, broadband internet was also coming out, and all this led to the perfect environment to form these online communities, such as GameSpy and Heat.net, and Microsoft's internet gaming zone called The Zone. Online play had been very tough beforehand, but now you could get into a service and have a friends list, make a bunch of online buddies, and then you don't have to disconnect from the internet, call someone on the phone, figure out what technical problem is going wrong, hang up your phone, reconnect to dial-up, and get into the game. You can just get in a room, talk to people, play a game. So these communities grew, and there was also this skunkworks group at Microsoft that liked DirectX a lot, and this wasn't a command from the overhead. This was just a bunch of engineers and programmers who said, hey, we've got DirectX. We have the technology. We can make a game console, and we can make it better than anyone else. So the Xbox movement started. It was almost a heroic movement inside of Microsoft where they were trying really hard, pitching it to the upper-level management to get funding, just barely getting by, until they released the Xbox in 2001. It still struggled with third-party support, but Microsoft did shift a lot of their funds from PC games to console games, funding more console developers, and is most famous for the Xbox Live gaming service. The Microsoft Internet Gaming Zone went down, Xbox Live came up, suddenly you got friends lists, you've got online chat, you've got multiplayer integrated into these games, and a culture built up around that on consoles as well as on PC. The big guns also started getting into the PC market. 2005, World of Warcraft came out. Steam came out in 2002 or 3 and slowly grew into what we knew today. When Half-Life 2 came out, that really put Steam into a lot of people's hands because it required Steam to be installed. But this is all more pro-gamer stuff, like people who are techies into video games. Well, the next bit, video games go a lot more into the mainstream. A lot of people who wouldn't traditionally be associated with video games get involved. So yeah, the core gaming audience is always going to buy video games, but what about everyone else? It got to the point where the best way to grow the market was to target people who were not traditional gamers. So PlayStation 2 came out in 2001. It had a DVD player, and kind of like the PS1, it was the cheapest DVD player on the market when it came out. So DVDs were huge at the time. PlayStation 1 was also huge, and the PS2 was backwards compatible. So, are you going to buy a DVD player that plays DVDs, or are you going to buy a DVD player that plays all the hottest games coming out? It's a pretty easy choice for a lot of people, and as a result, the PS2 got into a lot of living rooms. A lot of families who would never have video game consoles got them, even if they didn't buy it as a console. Nintendo saw what was going on, and they kind of followed it up with the Nintendo DS. So I was talking about other demographics. The Game Boy has kind of boy in the title. It's kind of more boy-focused. Nintendo DS took that out, even though Game Boy was a very popular brand name. They also put out a lot of games targeted at at demographics that would not traditionally be associated with video games. Older folks, working adults, families, and it worked well. So, a lot of people got into Brain Age, and the Nintendo DS was also backwards compatible with all the biggest handheld games at the time. It was compatible with Game Boy games, Game Boy Advance games, and they followed it up with the Wii, which was nothing short of a cultural phenomenon. So, a lot of families bought it because you have motion controls, it's exercise, it's healthy. A lot of old people, and honestly, a lot of everyone was like, wow, I'm actually bowling. This is the next big thing. Motion controls kind of faded away, but that gimmick was enough to get it into millions of homes and just send the world in a frenzy over it. A lot of bowling alleys suffered from that. And Nintendo used their successful IP to strengthen the Wii software library. Zelda and Mario games were still coming out, as they always have been. So the imitators of motion controls weren't so successful, but now we've got video games in a lot of households that it never would have been if it had just been targeted at gamers. Games become part of the culture at this point. So you've got G4, which is a cable TV channel completely dedicated to video games. Playing online is no longer nerdy. You have people asking for each other's gamer tags, and you don't have to go through some obscure online process to get a multiplayer game set up. PCs were ubiquitous. You could play them use a PC at the library, use one at your school, use one in your office, and when you had services like YouTube and Flash gaming, which did not require anything besides a web plugin, people could suddenly go online, watch videos of games, even if they didn't own the game. They could learn a lot about it. You could play any of thousands of Flash games, even if you're just a kid with a computer, with no money in your pocket. So, all these things put video games into a much broader audience, and the game market just kind of bubbled and bubbled and bubbled. Now, there were some AAA games coming out that were still targeting the core demographic. This happens all the time. Which is where we get to bit 8, Steam and saturation. So, a lot of these games targeting the core gamer demographic were all first-person shooters. And people started to feel that and get tired of it. This phenomenon called shooter fatigue came into play. And people wanted more unusual and different games, maybe some other genres, and maybe some other art styles, not just this gritty realism. So this kind of set up the marketplace for a lot of indie and smaller developers. So something else that happened was physical media started to fade away. Instead of buying discs, you can just sell things online. And then you don't have to produce CDs, which while cheap, it's still a cost. When you're producing thousands, that's a big cost. Online, you don't have to pay for that. You can also update your game, and indie developers, again, small, medium-sized developers, could get into publishing games. On the PC, Steam kind of became synonymous with PC gaming in the post-2010 age, and I've got to be a little careful here because it's hard to look at the present through the lens of history. But yeah, up to a few years ago, Steam was completely dominating the PC market. Unlike Nintendo, which used a lockout chip to prevent their competition from getting on their platform, Steam has a whole culture built up around PC gaming. So a lot of people will put their games on the Steam store, despite Valve's large cut of 30%, because there's a whole culture around it. If you put your game up somewhere else, people just might not download it just because it's not on Steam. So PC was very Steam dominated. Steam built up a lot of money in their coffers, and at this point every big video game platform controlling party, I guess, Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo, Steam, they all have a lot of money in their coffers. So even if video games were to stop selling for a whole year, all these companies could stay in business and stay strong. It's a much more stable market than it used to be. Phones and apps are also everywhere. iPhones, tablets. At this point, it's the market used to be quite segregated between all the different mobile OSs, but now it's stabilized so that you've got the Google Play Store and the App Store. So again, something that makes it very easy for smaller developers, medium-sized developers, to put their games out in front of millions of people, the mass market. So the barriers of entry are kind of getting lower than they ever were. So amidst all that, it gets a bit harder to get your game noticed, even if it is a bigger game. Some AAA games are flopping, because AAA games don't sell just because they're AAA games anymore. Pac-Man wasn't good, but it sold a lot of copies, even if it didn't sell all that they wanted it to. So one of the keys to a successful game in any era is making it a cultural phenomena. So a lot of companies continue to do just that. If people are really interested in a game, curious about it, they'll buy it in the 70s or today. And that's something that we see going across all eras. And that's all 8 bits. That brings us to today, which a lot of you guys could probably talk about just as much as I could. Thank you.
That was really good.
Alright, so I do know a lot more about most of this stuff, so if you guys have any questions about anything, I'm game.
You completely skipped over a staple of my childhood, the Super Nintendo.
Yeah.
But
Sorry, I forgot to mention that.
I'm old. I'm older than you, so.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff to cover, so I couldn't mention everything. That's another thing. I mentioned the Dreamcast every single time I rehearsed this, but there's a lot of content.
Oh yeah.
I struggled to rehearse this in under an hour, so hopefully I did that.
Do you want to summarize how the Dreamcast completely tanked Sega, basically?
No, the Dreamcast was the only thing that was going to be there, but
So yeah, one of the big things I was going to mention about the Dreamcast is that it shipped with a modem, so it was the first home game console to do so. It was the first time you saw an MMO taking place on a home console, so that really paved the way for Xbox to come in. And also Sega tanking did help Xbox as well, because Sega was now a third-party software developer. A lot of their games ended up on Xbox. Yeah, the Super Nintendo also, they competed with Sega, but yeah. Yes?
Do you think the reason why people stopped buying AAA games because they were AAA games started with 06, Sonic 06?
Oh man, I don't know how to answer that question.
That's a heavy burden to put on Sonic 06.
Yeah,
It's the first AAA game I can remember that flopped.
so I would say no then, because there were a lot of other AAA games that were very disappointing. If we go back to, I mean, heck, if you go to the very beginning, Space War kind of flopped. That doesn't really count. But E.T. on the Atari 2600, they had a massive marketing campaign for this game. It was a hit Hollywood blockbuster. They were going to make a game that was going to sell a lot of Atari consoles. And they made millions of cartridges. They sold a lot of them, but the game was overall very disappointing. And a lot of people see it as the worst video game of all time, despite all the hype.
could you really call that like a AAA game, though?
It was. It was made by, like, the biggest game developer at the time. It was put through all the biggest, it was going through the biggest publisher at the time, and it had a very big marketing campaign, bigger than any other game at that time.
It scales.
Yes.
Did you mention the Game & Watch?
I did not mention the Game & Watch. I forgot to mention handhelds that did not have interchangeable games. The big thing about the Game Boy was the fact that you could interchange the games. There were a lot of handhelds before then that just played one game, including Nintendo's Game & Watch, or a lot of Tiger Electronic games, like you may have seen at McDonald's in more recent years. And they were big. They just didn't get nearly as big as the Game Boy because of those interchangeable games. All right, anything else? All right, thanks a lot, guys. Keep making games. Make some good games. Make some cultural phenomena. History does repeat itself, so take some of this forward.